All right. So this is our third seminar session. It's a 5th of October, pardon me. Yeah, 5th of October, 2021. We're dealing with pages, only 10 pages really, about 97 till about 108 of on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ. So have that ready to hand, and I'm going to maybe ask your forgiveness or maybe just plow ahead. There's some ground I want to cover, including working through the text, but before we open to a more general discussion. So if you'll bear with me or just be with me, let's do that. Last time we ended with this, well, I sent an email out with my own little way of making sense of what we were trying to arrive at or proceed through last time. And so let me begin by taking you through how that's settled in my mind, and then moving into a couple of other introductory themes, and then the 4 works we're looking at. It seemed to me that one of the questions was, if we're holding logos and nihilism together, and we're wondering about meaning and the will, in my mind, we were wondering if the will could bring us to meaning, could draw us to meaning. And I want to pause for 1 second here. Nietzsche was infamous for delving into and exploring profoundly the idea of the will overall. Heidegger, Nietzsche's responder, who never self-admittedly never proceeded past him, but who was with Nietzsche for his whole life. In one of his shorter texts, he, I think, firmly offers a counter position to the focus on the will. And it's in his short book, Discourse on Thinking, when he talks about an openness to the mystery, and also he refers to the meaning that reigns in all there is. The meaning that reigns in all there is. Now, these thoughts we could find in Maximos, I'm certain, but I read them years ago, and these 2 phrases really stuck with me. Openness to the mystery, right? An openness to what is, not willing, and the meaning that reigns in all that is, and all there is. There's meaning there. It doesn't depend on us. That's a minor point. So if we're talking about logos and nihilism, and then the place of the will, the question is our image of will and freedom then, because that attends it, is it an image of inclination and predilection? Is the will part of how we understand what it means to be inclined or have a predilection? Or is it understood as something of our joy and delight? Is our freedom and will wrapped up in our enjoyment and our delight? Put another way, is any free search for meaning, is any free in quotation marks, scare quotes, is any free search for meaning better than inertia? But then I thought, well, inertia, we observe that. So it could also be stasis, or it could be stillness, or it could be peace. The idea is, are we wrapped up with the idea that a movement or an act of the will is better than not moving or acting in the will? Now, this to me, it strikes me that this is to place salvation on the level of choice or will, not being or personhood. That's one thing. And then it strikes me, and this is drawing on Louth's introduction, where he quotes Iris Murdoch, I believe, at the very end. And this is his point, but I'm paraphrasing, or Murdoch's point maybe. If one has to choose, then one is not free. If one is faced with a choice, one is not free. Now, yes. So is it the will and freedom as part of our inclination or part of our joy and delight? And maybe the way we can think about will touches a little bit on the Greek word for, well, nihilism is a Latinate word, right? In Greek, there are, back in philosophical language, there are two words which mean kind of, which might be akin to nihilism. And one is, it's uk, O-U-K, which means, or in Greek, O-U-K, which means nothing, nothingness, nothingness, or, well, nothingness. And then mion, without being. It means without. So not nothing or negation, but denying. Denying. Okay. So if the choice is between logos and nihilism, logos, what are we talking about with the nihilism? Nothing that is apart from Christ. But things that are can deny Christ. We do it all the time, and we have a history of that. I think that the will, or at least the fallen will, operates in that realm of nothingness, not pure nothingness, not the actual, not as if Christ isn't, because that's impossible, but in turning away, in denying, in choosing otherwise. Again, choice. Okay, just hold that in mind. In that case, if we're talking about being over against or denying, our will as inclination really means will as appetite, right? This word that David, I think, correctly translates instead of passion, right? Will as appetite. But we've also thought about will and freedom in terms of joy and delight. This, to me, suggests feasting, not individual inclination, but a kind of feasting together, the freedom of feasting together. Our being is in common and is held in common. Our being is common and is held in common. The will has to, fits within that. And I think the lesser will doesn't. I think the lesser will is of this other, where we think we're choosing salvation, where we're inclining, where we are asserting. This is where I see the end of Nietzsche's idea of will. But I mean, it's not the end, because this has been foreseen and analyzed by Maximos. It's a timeless query. So our images of will and freedom. Usually we use a language of being and non-being, and that works. That works. Okay, yeah. So our being held in common, or holding things in common. This is a way that we considered Maximos's mindset last time, when we thought about how he speaks or writes occasionally. He gathers what's already there. He gathers what's at the feast and he presents it. It's not him making his own thing. It's him gathering in and from the feast. So not assertion and argument, but gathering and arranging, or composing. Gathering and arranging or composing, to me, is the work of the mind. That's the work of the mind, gathering and arranging, composing. The work of the heart is prayer, insight, elaboration. Right? The work of the mind and the work of the heart, the nous and the cardia. We've talked about this. Work of the mind, work of the heart. They fit together in the spiritual life. And given articulation, they illustrate life. They do not use life to make a point. They don't abstract from life to make something my own and a point, okay? And all of this is trying to build seeds for stuff that comes later. Illustrates life, does not use life to make a point. If you're illustrating life, one of my favorite terms is concentration on a theme, to concentrate on a theme. I think that Maximus does this. I think he does it brilliantly. Concentration on a theme. To concentrate means to draw near, to dwell with, to speak out of, I think. To draw near, to dwell with, and speak out of. Draw near, dwell with. I like that, to speak out of. Theme, the root for theme means something set or place, to set or place. It's a verb, but it's translated into theme here, i.e. something harvested. You harvest a theme on which you'll concentrate. You harvest from the tradition. You don't invent or make, right? Theme is related in its root to thesis. Thesis also means a specific placing or setting, a placement or a setting. So theme is harvesting or gathering from a place or setting, and a thesis, the activity, is to specifically place or set. This placement or this setting, then, well, if we consider it in noetic terms, if we observe this distinction, which I made a couple of weeks ago, which I think holds, but it might not. Placement in the noetic realm is very difficult because the noetic realm is the realm of the mystical, the mysterion, and apophasis. Placement in the aesthetic, in the creative, in the physical, in the formed world, that's easier. That's easier to consider. Some people have called this kind of placement a topology of being. Right? But I want to think a thesis then is seeing things in place, or seeing things find their place, or seeing how things belong. A thesis. So we have concentration on a theme, and then we have the thesis. And the thesis means placing things to see how they belong. Placing things to see how they belong. Now, if you pardon me for a moment, this is the best illustration of what I'm trying to mean by that. It's Wallace Stevens' Anecdote of a Jar. Everyone will know it, but pardon me, I'm going to read it. Anecdote of the Jar, Wallace Stevens. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. Isn't that great? The placement of the jar in the coherent wilderness in such a way that it shows a new way of belonging. Okay, so that's thesis, theme thesis. Now, for a long time, I was trying to think, of what do we call the mind? What do we call that specific thing that each of us has that allows us to perceive or something like that? One of David Goa's favorite words is disposition. I like that very much. I like temperament, how things are tempered within you, right? But there's a Greek word that I found, which is diathesis, through the thesis, through the thesis. So theme, harvesting, setting or placing, harvesting, thesis, specific placing, which allows for belonging. Via thesis, it's translated with a bunch of English words. It means disposition, character, stance, mood, attitude, spirit, temper, disposal. English is rich in vocabulary. Via thesis. So then this is what we call the work of the mind and the work of the heart together. Via thesis. Work of the mind, composing, gathering, arranging, composing, and the work of the heart, prayer, insight, elaboration. Okay. Now those are just by way of just preliminary comments. I want to move through the four texts now with some brevity, I hope. But please be prepared to read along. And for each text, I've linked a theme, which I think is a theme of that text, and then an idea which I want to kind of pursue following the text. So first on the utility of the passions, right? On the utility of the passions. The theme to my mind is time. The theme is time. And then the idea, which, yeah, page 97. The idea, which we'll get to, is movement. So time and movement are what I'm thinking of here. I'll read a few passages. First, the first paragraph. These passions, and the rest as well, were not originally created together with human nature. For if they had been, they would contribute to the definition of human nature. But following what the eminent Gregory of Nyssa taught, I say that on account of humanity's fall from perfection, the passions were introduced and attached themselves to the more irrational part of human nature. Then, immediately after humanity had sinned, the divine and blessed image was displaced by the clear and obvious likeness to unreasoning animals. With everything I read this tonight, I'm not going to comment much because I'm very interested, and most of these texts are a bit beyond me. But I'm interested here in the idea of creation and errancy. How can creation err if it's just been created? So creation and errancy, there's something about time in there. Something about time in there. The second passage, just one second. Oh no, sorry, the two themes on it, creation and errancy, meaning that if the passions were co-original with human nature, it would have been included in the definition of human nature. Pardon me. That's creation and errancy. And then the immediately after humanity had sinned, that's what I'm wondering about. We're talking about ontology, not temporality, I think, or tradition, not history. So these are temporal words that he's using here. And I cannot, this is why I want to listen to everyone else too. I have to make sense of it in terms of ontology or tradition, not temporality or history. And then the third bit, and we can come back to all of these. I'm just moving through, so flag them and your own thoughts as well. The third is the final half paragraph of this section, of this short piece on page 98. In connection with God, the passions are mentioned for our benefit. Okay, revealing the saving and beneficial movements of divine providence, accommodated in a way that befits our own experience. Accommodated in a way that befits our own experience. So there's grace and experience there. With reference to the saints, on the other hand, when the passions are mentioned, it is because the saints cannot convey in corporeal speech, in aesthetic speech, in articulable speech, corporeal speech, their spiritual inclinations and dispositions toward God. Inclination, remember, is a clouded word here. And dispositions towards God apart from human passions. So then we have the language of aesthetics and also a hint of the language of the apophatic. Now, my ideas following this, and I'll just move through them quickly. Are we talking about, with the passions then, are we talking about change, right? Are we talking about conversion, like something being converted? Are we talking about healing? Healing, something being healed or whole, or fulfillment, or completion? What's the metaphor that Maximos is getting to here? And if it is, say, restoration, are we talking about an ontological restoration or a pneumatological, a spiritual, our very breath? And these images of movement and how they relate to the sense of temporality on the utility of the passions brings us back to one of the themes that we've returned to over and over again so far: ever moving rest, kinetic repose, right? Stasis. And Yeah, okay, yeah. Let's leave that for now. Okay. Well, I'm also interested in the movement implied in the prefixes trans and meta. Trans, so transformation and transfiguration, and meta, metaphor, metamorphosis. If these trans and metas are part of the movement we understand to be a part of the eternal. Now, like I said, just bear with me and flag what you need to. And the second short piece at Thalassium 2 on God's preservation and integration of the universe. Now, the theme here for me is completion. That's the mystery word, completion. And my idea, or the idea that I want to bring into relation with that, is experience, pira, experience. So completion is the theme and experience is what I want to get to. On God's preservation and integration of the universe. So look on page 99, the first lines of the response. God, as he alone knew how, completed the primary principles, logoi, of creatures and the universal essences of beings once for all. Okay, that sentence seems to imply that completed means done, because the next begins, yet he is still at work. But let's just pretend that, not pretend, let's assume that completed doesn't mean that all is done, because we know that creation is ongoing, and we know that even our images of stasis are ever moving. And then flip the page. This is on the second last line of the main text on page 100. The Father approves this work, the Son properly carries out, and the Holy Spirit essentially completes both the Father's approval of it all and the Son's execution of it. This in no sense can be a temporal completion in my mind. So there's complete and complete. Now, my question about experience. Is completion, again, is it ontological or spiritual? I'm assuming it's not temporal. I'm assuming that word means something along the words that we've been using, like wholeness and fullness. But I want to be careful. I want to bring it before you guys, because he could have said wholeness, fullness. Wholeness, health, being spiritually hale. And then I wonder, so if wholeness is related to spiritual health, what is our experience? Is it about impressions, things that press in on us, things that impress themselves on our heart, that impress themselves on our mind, and how we integrate that? Is that what experience is? Might be a form of experience. The other question I want to ask, and this ties back to before and later, is experience common? Is it individual? Is the experience of the completion of creation, or the completion of the Trinity, completeness maybe? Is it individual? Is it personal? Is it cosmic? One of these favorite words that we have. And personal, pardon me if this is speaking, repeating myself, but personal means in the mode of personhood. It's distinct from individual. We all take that as read. So that's the second little nugget with the second short work here. And then on the grace of holy baptism. This one I'm going to read more of, but I'm going to leave nearly completely alone, because I truly believe that this short work is really beyond me. And I don't want to say much about it because I don't think I should. I don't understand it. But on the grace of holy baptism, the theme here is doubleness. Doubleness. Is there a double baptism? That's what he's saying. And there's not, but why isn't there? Or double birth. The theme is doubleness, and then the idea, and I'm going to spend more time on this, is apophasis. Apophasis. So on the grace of holy baptism, doubleness, the theme, the idea, apophasis. So just look on page 10. I'm going to read about 15 lines, beginning with the beginning of his response. The manner of birth from God within us is twofold, twofold, not double, twofold. The one bestows the grace of adoption, which is entirely present in potency, dinami, in those who are born in God. The other introduces, wholly by active exertion or energy, that grace which deliberately, doesn't matter, reorients the entire free choice, there we go, free choice of the one being born of God toward the one who gives birth. The first bears the grace present in potency through faith alone. The second, beyond faith, there's a phrase I don't understand, beyond faith, also engenders in the knower the sublimely divine likeness of the one known, that likeness being effected precisely through knowledge. Therefore, the first manner of birth is observed in some because of their will, not yet fully detached from its propensity to the flesh, has yet to be wholly endowed with the Spirit by participation in the divine mysteries, wholly endowed with the Spirit by participation in the divine mysteries that are made known through active endeavor. And then just continuing on till over the page. The inclination to sin, inclination, fallen will, does not disappear as long as they will it. Right? The will is still there. For the Spirit does not give birth to this is a terrible translation, unwilling will, but converts the willing will, the holy will, let's say, towards deification. Now listen to this. Whoever has participated in this deification through cognizant experience, pira, is incapable of reverting from right discernment and truth once they have achieved this in action to something else besides, which only pretends, seeming non-being, to be that same discernment. I don't want to say anything else. That both of those passages I cannot comprehend, and I would like to, so I hope we can as we go on. And the rest too. I think that when we go to the conversation part, we might read much more of that. But let me circle back to this idea of twofold or doubleness. Twofold or doubleness. There's not a double birth, just like there's not a double Christ. A double Christ is an antichrist. Right? And apophasis. Apophasis, if we can say it's an expression, it's how we express something, we send it forth. Then it is the counterbalance to experience, impression, integration. The integration happens. Out of the integration, apophasis, the apophatic proceeds, okay? So when we talk about apophatic language, we're not talking about a doubling or a double in word or image or time. This is why St. Gregory of Nyssa says that every concept of God is a simulacrum of God and therefore an idol of God. Or, as David Jennings put it last time, we do not let the metaphor of love define God, right? The divine defines the metaphor. The metaphor is our pathway within reality. It's not our pathway, you know, that gives us reality. Reality is always there. So apophasis is not bifurcation. It's not splitting. It's not doubling. It's not saying this term is with this reality. It's integration somehow. Integration somehow. It's a form of communion, in other words, or at least apophasis looks towards a form of communion. Okay. Now continuing with apophasis for a little bit, because I want to think about We're going to come back to the work of the mind and the work of the heart. That's all in there. Apophasis is beyond articulation, right? As is communion. So apophasis is our kind of approach to communion, as it were. It's a form of vigilance because we know that what we are seeking is beyond articulation. So if our spiritual life is characterized in terms of reality and illusion, the words we've been using, truth and deception, Christ and Antichrist, then I think that the apophatic approach, the apophatic stance better, helps us to not confuse the two. It helps us to not confuse on the level of articulation, Christ and the Antichrist, not speak the name of the Antichrist instead of Christ. In other words, not mistake one for its double, not mistake something real for its double. Because in a way, our spiritual reality is only different when we make it. So when we inflate it, when we confuse it, when we observe some inappropriate movement within it, i.e., when we lack the kind of discernment we need to see its own beauty, its own particularity, its own singularity. In other words, we're tempted to extend, tempted, lead us not into temptation, lead us not into those places where we will extend our will and extend our image of God onto creation, right? We extend it improperly. And the apophatic or apophasis is about, I'm not sure the word, recovery, renewal, restoration maybe, of limit. Apophasis is about recovering limit or finitude, but not finitude in its guise as mortality, right, which is death, but finitude in its true phenomenon as enfleshed life, the end of which is communion. So apophasis is oddly, it is gesturing to the beyond, and what it is doing is healing our sense of limit, finitude. So this stance assumes and participates in reality. It's not an abstraction. It's not declaring reality or stating or asserting reality. It's corresponding to reality. It registers or articulates, apophasis registers or articulates reality in movement, in process, in the moment of metamorphosis or transformation, transfiguration, right? All of which I think are subsets of integration. But apophasis tries to register and articulate reality in the movement of metamorphosis, change, integration. In other words, the apophatic is about everything being renewed, everything being made new again, all things made new. And its movement, from within, through, and with, and beyond the phasis, the word. From within, with, because it stays with, doesn't discard, through and beyond. In a way, then, it's akin to the simpler idea of ecstasis, how we move from within ourselves to beyond ourselves. Now, forgive me if this is a little bit thorny, but I want to make these distinctions. Often, when we think of the apophatic, we may be tempted to consider the English word ineffable, which is a fantastic ineffable, the ineffable. And for a long time, I just equated. I thought that the realm of the apophatic was the realm of the ineffable, and it might be. But I'm obsessed with trying to learn bits of Greek. And in our liturgy book, I have a Greek English on one side. And in the liturgy, there more than once, there is a dimension of the word ineffable, ineffable God, what have you, something like this, thine ineffable mysteries. And I looked at the Greek, and it's never apophatic. It is, well, two translations that are prominent is aphatos, unspeakable. The ineffable is the unspeakable. And then we remember that apophatic is not aphatos, it's not the unspeakable. And the other translation of ineffable was anekphrestos, so non-ekphrastable, for those of us who are literary scholars. Ekphrasis is the translation from one medium to another in the concrete world, poetry into music, or dance into lines, into piano, right? So the ineffable in the language of the liturgy is either the unspeakable, the unsayable, or the unekphrastable, the thing not possible to transform otherwise, but not apophasis. That's why I keep coming back to this word. I think that it hasn't been seen yet well, or just not by me anyways. So the apophatic properly dwells within noetic, right? The ineffable then, as the aphatic or the anekphrastic, is with the aesthetic, the created world. And for a long time, I thought, how are we creative in Orthodoxy? How can we be creative in our tradition? Because like Maximus says more than once, not innovation, not creativeness, this is with us. This is, remember, gathering, harvesting, right? But there has to be some way to consider discoveries of the mind. So pardon me, I'm going to read from this book momentarily. Christianity and Classical Culture by Yaroslav Pelikan. Now, he's quoting Gregory of Nyssa. What I really want is the Gregory of Nyssa quote, but Pelikan's comments are superb, and I haven't read the Nyssa text he's looking at. Okay. It was nevertheless possible, even for the natural human mind, right? Nevertheless possible, even for the natural human mind, for example, through such intellectual exercise as the methods of geometry, to be led step by step through visible delineations to truths beyond sight. So it's possible for the natural human mind to achieve a method that will lead them step by step through visible delineations to truths beyond sight. That's Gregory of Nyssa. Here's his comment. That gift of transcendent reflection, which he called epinea, I'm going to come back to this word, epinea, was the foundation of all the other human sciences and skills, and it was more precious than any other quality of the human mind. Gregory of Nyssa defined it in a careful and comprehensible formula as, and then here's Gregory of Nyssa again, the method by which we discover things that are unknown, going on to further discoveries by means of what adjoins to and follows from our first perception with regard to the thing studied. So epinea is the method by which we discover things that are unknown, going on to further discoveries by means of what adjoins to and follows from our first perception with regard to the thing studied. He continues. When we have formed some idea of what we seek to know, by adapting what follows to the first results of our discoveries, we gradually conduct our inquiry to the end of our proposed research. We have formed some idea of what we seek to know. By adapting what follows to the first result of our discoveries, we gradually conduct our inquiry to the end of our proposed research. Now that is, very finely written, very interesting, and I think insightful. But he's not talking about the apophatic here. He's not talking about God, I think, so I say. I think he's talking about what I call the work of the mind earlier, which needs to be joined. He said the natural human mind has access to this, access to the ineffable, right? The grace-filled, or we could play with the language here. The blessed natural, the grace-filled, the created, whatever, has more capacity than that. So the apophatic is not that. It's not the ineffable. It's not the unspeakable or the non-ekphrastable. Like I said, pardon me, this is rocky. Epinea, I'm going to come back to this word epinea and play with it a little bit. the two words for the two centers of the human spirit in Orthodox Christianity are the nous, the intellect. Nous is best. Nous noetic, the faculty of the nous, and the cardia, the heart. Right. The nous is that which grants truth. Okay. And remember this when we get to aletheia later, because I think it'll matter. The nous is that which grants truth, or which truth grants, maybe. But nous, nia, this is the epinea. This is the root of the epinea, transcendent reflection that Gregory Nyssa referred to. Epi means center, epidemic, pandemic, epidemic. Epinea, something centeredly on the nous. Ennea, as in the within the nia, that's a word for idea, concept, conception. Paranoia, where we get paranoia from, paranoia is vigilance or discretion. And dianoia, through the nous, is the intellect, the mind or reason. So these are all lesser terms than the nous, or derivative terms from the nous, which is where the apophatic lies. The apophatic is that which prevents us from being tempted to see doubles, which is why I don't comprehend on the grace of holy baptism, because I don't have apophatic knowledge. I'm trying to point at where it might be, but I can't see that, right? Anyways, so there's some hope for people, people like me. Now, think about this. Do we have the nous, we have the dianoia, and then we have the idea, the logos, which is sometimes translated as mind or reason. We begin to see how inadequate the simple word mind or reason is in translating that word logos, when we realize how extraordinarily rich these church mothers and fathers considered what's happening in the mind and the heart. So the work of the mind and the work of the heart must be integrated. They're integral. And in the work of the mind and the hearts, we have to be careful to distinguish, again, prayer, which is, it partakes of the holy, it's the holiness as truth, partakes of life. Prayer and insight. Insight grants articulable truth. Apophasis is not about insight. These other things that we were just talking about in the realm of the aesthetic, or the realm of the speakable, or the epinea, that's insight. Prayer partakes of life, or as holiness is truth. Okay, now on to the last little section we have here. We're getting there. It's very interesting. Some of you know the fellow Gary Saul Morrison, and he just put out a book called Minds Wide Shut. And one of his chapter titles is Reading the Scriptures as Prayer, Not as Proposition. And I thought, how interesting that a prominent, very prominent American intellectual working in literature would be that straightforward about a simple but important truth. So on spiritual progress and virtue, okay. The theme here is ever, or apophasis. We have that word translated for us in the footnotes on page 106. The everness of our struggle, the ever ascending struggle. They call it perpetual striving here, which is based on the St. Paul's image of the runner striving. So on spiritual progress and virtue, the theme is ever, or perpetual struggle, and the idea I want to link with that is truth. Now, I admit to having some issues with this piece, because I have, well, let's back up. I think that reading the scriptures literally is clearly mad. And I think that reading the scriptures figuratively is also clearly mad. I think that there has to be something in between. Because if you just read it literally, you're abstracting. And if you just read it figuratively, you're abstracting too. Now, I've come to think that if one is going to ever explain a story, or gloss a story or draw from a story. The layering on of meaning onto that event, onto that real thing that happened, has to do two things. It has to deepen the reality, the meaningful reality of that event, and it has to draw that event more firmly into our whole habit of being, our whole tradition, our whole sense of belonging. It can't just abstract from it. Now, Maximus doesn't just abstract from the story. He's careful, he's more careful, but a lot of people do. But he verges on that sometimes, verges on this. It makes me nervous. Not for him, but for what it might mean for readers. So let's just look at a couple of passages. These are very quick. Right, the very beginning. Whoever intelligently examines the enigmas of the scriptures with a fear of God, okay, phobos, awe, fear, and for the sake of the divine glory alone, and removes the letter as though it were a curtain around the spirit. See, that's the language that makes me nervous. But he's not being categorical. If he was, be a problem. Shall discover everything face to face. That's nice. And at the, let's see, partway through 106 is when he brings in the apophasis and so on. But I want to look just at one more on page 107, beginning of the first whole paragraph. Therefore, the word of God, the word of Holy Scripture remains good and noble, always offering spiritual truth in place of the literal, for those who lay hold of its saving meaning with the eyes of the soul. This is to me, this is a matter of degree or emphasis. But I want to flag that well, it's not that important to keep going on about. The literal is, leaving behind the actual story is hugely problematic in my mind. And that's what I meant earlier by talking about illustrating life, not using life to make a point, not drawing from life to make a point, right? So when we read scriptures and when we consider, what is this? Is this Exodus? Yeah, the passages in Exodus in which Maximos is evoking, and we think of the truth of them. What's the enduring interest? What's the truth? What's the ever bit? Why does it still matter, right? It's not to abstract, because we're not leaving that behind. We're holding that story too. We're bringing it with us too. So what's the truth? So here I want to think about truth for a little bit. I think that truth, like the good, the beautiful, to kalon, the kalon, that the truth as aletheia calls forth. I think that's first. The truth calls forth. Or that's its aspect. I think that its first element is that it brings to light. The truth brings to, I think that's the best definition of aletheia that we have. It's better than every other one I've read. And it's because aletheia also provides the root for latency. So that which is not latent, that which has been brought to light, okay? This is, some phenomenologists have gotten very close to this by talking about truth as disclosure, right? But that's not what I mean, brings to light. The second is aletheia draws into presence. So it brings to light and it draws to presence. So what do we mean by that? Well, lethe is the river of oblivion. It's the river of forgetting. It's the river that you cross in order to go into hell, into non-being, right? So aletheia, the drawing back from that, is drawing into life, drawing into presence. And the third element I want to put out here is that in calling to us, in bringing to light, and in drawing into presence, aletheia, truth, conjoins the elemental and the ultimate, okay? It conjoins the elemental and the ultimate. In other words, the concrete and the spirit, let's say, or thesis and logos. It holds these together in the model of personhood, okay? In the model of personhood, in the tonality of personhood. And this means that truth or aletheia is a movement, not a state, okay? A movement, not a state. But this is the last thing I'll say, pardon me. To harken back to the very beginning, aletheia is not movement as will is movement. And it's not a state as the logos is a stasis. Okay, the idea of stasis connected with logos, that idea of stasis is not what we mean by we say that truth is not a state or a stasis. Okay, so it's not just full-on movement and full-on stasis. There are gradations in each of them. Okay, pardon me, that was well, now I just stopped. I had no follow through. I put all my effort into the first few steps. I'm not sure how to take the next step. But well, there's a number of things that we could get at here. And pardon me, I'm going to just pause for a while because I've led everything so far. So where do we go? And I mean, if we need a place to go, I know a place we can go.
Well, I think there are lots of places to go. I don't think that's the problem. I don't think that's the problem. You've raised some very interesting points. They weren't the points I had taken from the readings. I don't think any of them were.
That's good.
But you know, it is a testimony to the richness and the pregnant potency of Maximus's writing, that in 10 pages we will, you know, you've talked an hour and I could talk another 2, and I imagine everyone else could probably add to it on some of these issues. So maybe if we want to, we could go to each of the 4 readings. I find the initial and I don't want to distract, and if other people want to pick up where you are, but I guess I'm the kid still with the training wheels on. So I'm having difficulty on the utility of the passions, that his conclusion that the passions don't constitute part of the definition of what it means to be human, and that they aren't originally created together with human nature. And I'm not sure if he's limiting the definition of the passions to pleasure, grief, desire, fear, and rest.
The rest.
And the rest, yeah. Oh, I see, and the rest. Okay, well then that catches it. What my concern was. So, I mean, we have in Scripture examples of Christ who, while fully human, is also fully God, who is without sin, yet is with passions. Jesus cried. Jesus grieved. When you read what I think is exceptionally good humor, he laughed, if internally, not externally. So
Jewish jokes.
Pardon me, David?
He certainly told Jewish jokes.
He certainly did. Yeah, exactly. And clearly there was lots of pleasure, as well as, you know, the week of the Passion. So I'm having difficulty with the understanding that the passions are not originally created with human nature, and that that they don't constitute part of the definition of human nature, and that God, to the extent that he's defined as having passions, is only done so that we can understand who God is, not because they are inherent in who God is, as revealed in Jesus Christ. So I, you know, as I say, I'm the kid with training wheels, and I don't want to slow down the ride. So if everyone else is sort of, you know, I could take a remedial, you know, oh well, here, read this and let's move on. I'm A-okay with that, but I'd like to just raise that.
I don't think so. But David,
What you're
David, go
saying
on.
is important, David.
That's very important.
Very important because, and we'll be spending an awful lot of time on this as we move into Maximus's work. I think I said before that there is lots of the whole language of passion, desire, appetite, I think is not very clear in this tradition until you have a long look at it. I think you can make it clear. I think I understand it a little bit anyways. So here's what I would say about this particular passage. The word passion here is suffering. This is the Greek word for suffering.
Right.
So if we look at the Cappadocians, for example, they certainly understood that human beings, we are created with desire, natural desire, the desire for delight, the desire for love, the desire for nurture,
Beauty. Yeah.
desire for beauty, the desire for wonder. And those are understood to be part of our created being.
Good. Okay.
What happens is that when one of those falls into the center, I mean, maybe this is too stoic an argument, but I don't think so. When one of those falls into the center and becomes an appetite,
Okay.
that's where the suffering begins.
Right.
That's when it is a passion. So when he says that we're not created with our passions, we're not created with our sufferings. That doesn't mean we aren't created with natural desire.
Okay. Okay. Boy, that's thank you.
Do you
That's
agree,
great.
Andrew, with that?
No, pardon me. I agree wholeheartedly, but I think you put that beautifully. And I like the image of weight when it kind of weighs more, when it weighs you down in the center, when there's not an equilibrium, when there's not integration. I think you put it very well. Yeah. Yeah.
Lorraine, you've looked at
Yeah.
this as well. I mean, does that make sense in terms of your understanding?
Yeah, and I had the same question, David Jennings, that you had when I first read this the first time. I was sort of like, what? Hang on, whoa. But then I thought about it, David, and it made me think of like John Cassian and those guys in the sense of, where, and I wondered if he was alluding to this, is, when those, I mean, very colloquially, when those virtues become vices, right? When those goods start to tip over into these other things. And so I wondered around that because of the things that he kind of, mentions in terms of like, sorry, I'm just looking at, like, he talks about kind of, fear and grief and those kind of things, like, and so, and this allusion to, he says, here's something to embrace and hold on to, virtue and knowledge, that their kind of role is to almost bring us kind of back. And in our humanity, God doesn't need to be taught a lesson and brought back. He's always stayed kind of in the middle. He's always sort of stayed within that faithfulness to the virtues, but we sort of tend to sort of wander out and play for a while and then wander back. And so in that case, I was thinking, maybe he's trying to say, like, we are created for sorrow, like Jesus cried, but we're not created for despair or depression. There's kind of a slight nuance there, but that's how I tried to interpret it, because otherwise I was like, oh, I can't get my head around this. So,
and even on the and I don't want to hopscotch, but just the point about, even in the text on baptism, he writes that God has the sheer desire, that we surrender our, that we surrender willingly to the Spirit. So it's yet another example, but through the lens of what David has said, that we're not hearing, from what I hear, David, if I could repeat it back, because all of this is a mouthful, but passion in this sense is not desires in and of themselves, of which many are good.
They're all good.
They're all good. This is a passion that is suffering, which arises when our desires become central rather than ancillary to our central point of deification, I would suspect.
Right. When our when an appetite colonizes our integrity.
Oh gosh,
It's better.
I'm sorry, everyone's gonna have to wait for a minute here while I write that one down. Appetite colonizes
Our integrity.
our integrity.
It dissolves.
It's the overweighing. It's the weighing too much. And I want to respond to something you said, Lorraine, and harken back to what David Goh said a moment ago. It is true that the even in the crude language that you used and flagged, but that if we think about virtues and the vice, that kind of thing, that's one way of comprehending how certain elements of the human person are part of our experience, right? But I think the reason why I like and noted David's idea about it weighs too much, it's not just virtues and devices. It might be virtues that just weigh too much, right? They didn't turn evil. They just weigh too much, right? And
they destroy your capacity for presence.
Yeah, I had something else, but yeah. No, I mean, I had something else that I forgot. Pardon me, David. You're right. They destroy our capacity for presence.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
For me then, I mean, I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because I was also trying to think about this how he ties this idea then of movement and desire, right? Because ultimately, I presumed he was speaking of passions in terms of, appetites. And so, I mean, I think it raises an interesting question for me around what is it that process of movement or corruption, for lack of a better word, of the, and now Andrew, you got me thinking about will, but I mean, and that's how originally I was thinking it, right? Thinking about this idea of kind of will, like we're drawn to the good, or a couple times alludes to this idea that we should be drawn to the good. I mean, he's sort of saying humanity is on this journey towards God eventually, right? That's our final end. So we're out, we're kind of always moving there. And so I guess it made me think about, like, again, using very simplistic language, what are those points, or how does that perversion, corruption crawl in? And is that very, like, does that stem from just these images that we create for ourselves? Is it almost like we think we get there and then we get stuck because we think we found God and actually we're staring at a spoon? Like, I don't know, but I mean, I guess I've been kind of wrestling with that, and how that then relates to baptism.
Please. Oh, let me, I think that's a good connection. And I want to open something up for Michael Burke and also for David. And Lorraine, taking your clue, maybe it would be neat to shift our focus to that text for a little bit. David Jennings has already brought it in a little bit. And that's, to me, the strangest text that we're reading tonight. But I wanted to go back to how we open this up. The theme we observed with time, or that I brought forth was time. And that's pretty much what we're talking about. How does transformation, disfiguration, let's use figuration, disfiguration, something disfigured into its ugly opposite. Is that in time? Is it change, conversion? Are we talking about healing? This is how or even completion, fulfillment, and how we think about about the opposite process we're talking about now, crudely, good into not good. With baptism, it's good into more good, or being into well-being, as David Goh so nicely put the other week and set forth, being that has a vivid, a vibrant awareness of its source, of its well-being, constant connection. Yeah. But these are the two questions. David, I would like to just open it wide up to you on the grace of Holy Baptism, and I'd like you to take us through whatever you thought there. But just prior to that, Michael, if I may bend your ear a little bit, because I think this is part of it too. Referring back to the very first things that I was trying to articulate based on what we talked about last week, and then I tried to make sense. I know you've been thinking about it, or I hope you had the chance, the opportunity to think about it. But around this discussion of the will and of what our own efforts do, because if we're talking about the passions, we're talking about healing or restoration or recovery, what have you, then we are maybe back in the realm of human activity. Right? You got to mute that, David.
Sorry, I'm trying to find a name, and this podcast I was listening to today was so important on this very point. But anyway, so keep going. Sorry.
Not to worry. If we're in the realm of activity, is it the realm of will? It may be tenuous, but I want to bring it back to.
I'm sorry. I'm going to mute myself. I don't know why.
All right. Not to worry. Michael, can we bring it back to that first question, barring the little hiccups just now? If you've been thinking about it, what do you make of that question? Logos and nihilism and the will. Huh.
I don't want to derail any of the points that we've been traveling down. So I'm kind of, let me just see if I can frame my thoughts, because what I've been thinking about is something I kind of hesitate to bring up. It's this issue that I raised in an email about the idea of self-love, which I sort of readily agreed was a problematic notion, and it's a widely held view, outside of Christianity. Although when we think about people like David Hume, for example, even though he seems to be antithetical to the tradition, I think he's simply saturated with it like everyone else. And so in a conventional frame of mind, he says something that we've all heard many times before. It's a standard view. It goes back to a discussion we can find in Aristotle. It was a kind of a cliche view back then, namely that the idea of self-love isn't intelligible. And then I was astonished to find that David Hume, 100 pages in the treatise, when he suddenly says that self-love is the source of all injustice. I think that's anyone living today would say that something like a kind of resentment might be, but that could also be wound up with self-love. But then just to flip it around, it could also be a kind of unwholesome pathological regard for oneself, which at times maybe David Hume should have read the Underground Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky. I think it's a kind of flattening enlightenment thing, which I just found astonishing, because unlike the kind of nuanced way that David Goa has led us into thinking about the passions, and not simply seizing on the passions, but thinking in context in nuanced ways. David Hume, it's astounding, whose ethics, like almost every British thinker of the period, Adam Smith and what have you, thinks of ethics, and everything is based in the passions. And so it was surprising when David Hume was talking about love and hatred, and when he makes this bold categorical statement that there is no such thing as self-love, he antecedent to that, a paragraph before, he says that love and hatred are simple passions, or simple things. And I think that is a blunder of ramifying significance.
Mm.
And I don't think anyone who believes in the infinitude of reality of the logos could ever believe that. It's an empirical view. And we get a slight hint of that in Aristotle. I don't really want to malign Aristotle at all. And I'm actually, because Aristotle explicitly, unlike Hume, actually does the work and actually thinks about this notion of self-love, and he leaves it up in the air. His lecture notes that were assembled after his death in the Nicomachean Ethics. And he sort of wonders, well, if the self is a composite thing, then maybe we can talk about self-love. And I've been plagued by this thought. So this is the thought I was hesitant about, but I think it's sort of relevant, certainly to Christianity, that the Christian idea of the self is, I think composite would be the wrong word, but we could help Aristotle along if we see the self as relational, as both Davids have reminded us, a few weeks ago. And that should free us up from cardboard notions of the self that even thinkers as great as Aristotle might be veering toward, by thinking of, instead of saying that the self in a Christian sense is composite. I think the very nature of the Trinity is that we have to think of the self in relational terms, but it's not simple versus composite. So we can leap beyond Aristotle's, and then we can talk about a wholesome form of self-love. If someone has a kind of natural feeling, joy of virtue, they, in effect, are related to themselves in a loving, respectful way. And if someone, just to think of an extreme contrast, we could go off in many different contrary contrasts. If someone has a deep addiction to something that is hurting them and other people with whom they're in relationships, that kind of self-regard is not really self-regard. I would say it's a kind of self-loathing, and there's part of that person, and this might get back to that mysterious passage which Andrew was wondering about, how once we go down this process of, this wasn't the word, but deification, once we are going down a certain way, once we, or Plato's idea of, stepping outside the cave and seeing the light, I think there is a certain sense in which you can't forsake that, because that's an essential part of yourself, a part that deserves to be regarded, because you're not simply regarding yourself in a kind of atomized isolation, but in relation to others, and in a specific, well, ultimately in relation to the deity, because we're all part of the deity, we're all made in the image. But the way to think about it is not as just different composite parts, but as relationally. And there's something mysterious about ourselves that we can't really apprehend very readily, that it gives rise to, or it is indistinguishable from desires and passions that are integrated in the way consonant with deification. And that's essentially what we are. And that process can't be mistaken, even though when we're trying to characterize, that's where we start projecting and find ourselves in the thicket of our own projections. And that's where we can make errors, as we inevitably do. We're mortal creatures prone to hamartia, and of course. So anyways, that's I realized I was sort of spewing out a lot there, but I thought it does sort of wind back to this idea that, and I feel very uncomfortable because talking about self-love isn't it doesn't seem like a very wholesome way, but I'm just trying to suggest that once we see ourselves as relational beings, there's a way, it's important to to have regard for oneself, because people who behave badly often are directing against themselves something very contrary to a spirit of agape or regard. So to be self-regarding, anyways, and that's what Aristotle comes to. I think he does it on the basis of the wrong ontology, right? I think he's sort of hinting that maybe the self is a composite thing. And if he instead he were to suggest that it's a relational thing, I think he'd be approaching a Trinitarian notion of the self. And then, so his upshot is, translating into Christian terms, is that those who are, he doesn't say this, but those who are in a process of deification, those who are good, who are outward directed, and this is what he says, who are interested in helping other peoples in a virtue and living a noble life, it's good that they're lovers of self, or they have a relationship which is self-regarding in the right way. And I think that's the way we can maybe talk, but not that I'm on some kind of kick. I wouldn't want to be on a kind of Ayn Randian kick that we should, love the ego. That would be like slipping off into this.
I thought she was your favorite. No, you quite
Thank
liked
you.
her. Okay, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
good. I'm glad we're in the
Michael, let
Ayn
me-
Rand fan club. Yeah, great.
Michael, let me respond to something that you said, if I can, or ask you, really put it back when you ask you a question, because I think what you've just teed up there leads nicely into where I think it would be nice to move next, would be to on the grace of holy baptism. You do mention that passage, which I said is beyond me. Just I don't know what he means, so I'd like to hear about what he means tonight. But Michael, the way that you tread carefully when talking about self-love there, I feel you, I hear you. But if, I want to go back to a question I asked earlier. If experience is common, not individual, if it's common, or even more, if it's, as we suggested, perhaps in the realm, in the form of personhood, right? In the mode of, in the tropos of personhood. Right, relational, as you say. When we say personal in Orthodoxy or in the tradition, we mean relational, and we also mean based on the figure of Christ, and also finite, and a number of other things. But relational is one of the things, one of the absolutely key things there, right? Ecstasis goes out in order to come back. But if experience, Pira, is not individual, is relational at least, or at least common, if the work of your heart is a work of love, then you have love, a love which will permeate all of your relations, right? Or what is held in common. And we are part of what's held in common. We are part of our relations, right? So that love that we have through the divine, for the divine, within the divine, is also for all of what the divine has made, also us. That might be a way of not making that even just a language seem a little bit odd, right? Which I'm not sure if that's what you're indicating, but I could see how someone could think that promoting self-love would seem a little bit odd, right? But maybe if we think of experience, or the realm in which we're imagining that act of love, individual, common, personal, relational, maybe that's a way forward. What do you think? Is there something there? Is there not, Michael?
The process of deification is future-looking process. There's another term, self-transcending. Now, and again, I want to be a little hesitant here, because I don't think that self-transcending or self-overcoming deification is something engineered by the self. That would feed very quickly into a kind of narcissistic philosophy that probably owes itself to a kind of comic book, Nietzschean, existential, Sartrean, view of things. We create ourselves, and that, I think that's a very boring thing, because what we self-consciously create is something very paltry and banal, and is actually interfering with a proper relationship to us, which is always beyond ourselves. The logos is something that is infinitely beyond ourselves, even though it's part of our very being. But that's why I think that there is a sense in which it is odd to speak of self-love, because it usually what people have in mind is they're attached to something that is actually preventing them from being in that infinitely future, well, okay, this is a slightly flamboyant way of putting it, relationship with the divine, the logos. And it's not just being happy with what you are. I think, where we are should be outward in relation to other people. But if there is something mysterious about us that is always dissatisfied with what we are in a good sense, and loving that part is to release ourselves from the things that we should perhaps feel interfere with our proper relation with God.
Michael, is the deification as the basis of this? I don't think so. I think that it is, to draw on just an earthly analogy, and it's inadequate. The fact that I love my wife and the fact that she loves me does lend something to me learning to love myself. Not because of that narcissistic thing, but that to which I attribute worth has said I am worthy. I think, and that's not because I deify over time or something, but it's right now. God, the dignity of the human person that is bestowed upon us because we're made in the image of God, is not contingent upon deification. It is right now. As a matter of fact, so is a rock and a rosemary bush. So all of creation has this pregnant worth, not pregnant, it actualized worth, because God has declared it so. To the extent that I love God, I must love that he loves, which includes myself. Now, so you can have a self-love. I think that the issue that we usually have with self-love, though, practically speaking, is relativeness. That is, I love myself more than I love others. So I can have a self-love in part because everyone else is an asshole, or however you want to phrase it, right? That I'm the greatest thing in the world, so of course I would love me. But I think that the approach of God has done this for everyone. Therefore, I can love myself because he has bestowed upon me worth, just as he has every other person in the universe. That does, I don't think that diminishes my self-love in the phrase that I think you're getting to. But it doesn't count on me or the other person to be further along in deification to increase that self-love in a sense. That's kind of how I would see it, but anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you've said many things that should probably encourage me to, take a few steps back from what I was saying.
No, I don't think you should step back at all. I think you're onto something there, and it was
well,
a really good question.
Maybe just to sort of play out the dialectic just slightly. What I might say, and I'm not sure if I shouldn't just kind of retreat, but I'll sort of be brave and venture forward. And I would say this, that we should also think of others, even the meaning of a rock just to start off at a basic point, as something, the ontology of its meaning is just uncapturable in a sense. And the wife who loves us and whom we love, and it's always a fraught thing, any relationship is, but it's not that horrible kind of cynical way that Sartre thinks of, for example, two people always missing each other. I think it's precisely the opposite.
Exactly.
They never can consummate their appreciation of each other, not because they're missing each other, but because it is a process of infinite deification.
Yeah.
So I would sort of suggest that even in the most concrete way, thinking of a rock or a shrub, even though the flower will, die, it is part of everything we engage is part of an infinite deification. That's how I see our perceptions, and that's why I can't see love and hate as simple emotions, or any emotion as simple. But I realize that we're finite beings, and so we'll always not only just make mistakes, but whatever we do will always be finite and unconsummated in a sense. So I'm sort of doubling down in a sense, but I'm kind of at the same time wondering whether I've kind of missed the mark a
No,
little.
I don't think you've missed it. And in fact, I think you've touched on, and I know Andrew saw something else in the second writing, but I think you touched on exactly the central point of the second point on the integration of the universe. And that is that deification is not only for humans, it is of the cosmos and our relationship within that cosmos, that all is deified, that there's a restoration of all things, not just human things. And I think you like, to me, that for the second reading, that to me is the astounding line. And the point that you're chasing there, Michael, I think reinforces that, which I would really encourage. So I don't think you should be backtracking at all. I just put sort of, you might want to think of a different language. In fact, I would say even Aristotle, as you talk about the composite thing, when Aristotle talks about friendship, it could be ethics or something like that. There's an element, anytime we talk about how much we love friendships, we are talking about self-love because we're part of the friendship. That's what is so exciting about it. That's what's so lovely about friendship, is I'm part of that. You can get theoretical and everything, but the reason we get excited about it, the reason why we're so strongly about friendship, as is, I think, Aristotle, in his writing, is because we are part of that. So I think that there is an element there of a self-love of friendship because we feed on that relational aspect and we know how important that is. And a friend does honor me. I have to recognize that. I am honored when I have a friend because that friend is necessarily honoring me in some way. And sorry, Andrew, I interrupted you, which was probably to clarify my misunderstanding of your point.
No, pardon me, David Jennings. I thought I broke in, but not on purpose. But this is what I want to, first of all, it's unfortunate this volume, I almost want to apologize for it because it's pretty decent scholarly, but the translations to my mind are clunky, right? They shouldn't have translated the word theos as deification in my mind. Deification seems to, first of all, our language, even in the seminar, is not deity, deus. It's God, theos. It's more of the other. But second of all, the ification part of it kind of makes it sound like it's some kind of fact or something like that. And if we think of the cis, it's deification is a translation of theosis, and the cis at the end, right? Like apophasis or emphasis, right? It's the ongoing nature of the thing being centered, right? And I want to turn to David Goa here, because I think that in ways that I am interested in learning, that baptism is probably a more important word than theosis for us right now. it certainly is for, I would say, for Maximus, or at least it's a more explicitly important word. But David Go, I would like to, if you don't mind me just putting it on you for a moment, I would like you to follow whatever you will of what has preceded, but thinking about on the grace of holy baptism, thinking about this work, this text in particular. And now I regret not reading the whole thing out because I see that our evening is proceeding. I think this is an extraordinarily important text. But David Goa, what are your thoughts here? What have you been pondering? Is there something that's, I mean, that passage which I admitted that I gladly admit that I don't understand at the top of page 104. I know that stands out for you too, but I know that several other things do too. What do you think?
Well, I can say a few things perhaps. I really appreciated this exchange, Michael and David, that you just had. I think it's really to the heart of the matter. So thank you for that. So just a couple things that that strike me. This notion that the manner of birth from God within us is twofold. And Andrew pointing out this is not double, it's twofold, it's folds. That it's folds, it's unfolding. So the notion that in our created being, we are the image of God. As you were talking, the two of you were talking, I also thought of how many priests in confession have said probably more, they probably said this more than they've said anything else, as if I would know, to people confessing to them, which is, my friend, my daughter, my son, my child. Why do you hate what God loves? You. God loves you. Give yourself a break. Recognize everything you've told me seems to me to go back to the fact that you have not heard those words that came from the heavens when Jesus Christ was baptized in the Jordan. This is my beloved son. This is my beloved daughter. This is my beloved child, in whom I am well pleased. Well pleased in your being. The fact that you are pleases my heart. So as I think I mentioned before, one of the striking things to me about, I mean, baptism is of course a theophany. It's built on the account we have in the gospel of the baptism of Jesus Christ in the Jordan at the hands of John the Baptist. It's a theophany, it's a showing forth. And every baptism is a showing forth. It is showing forth the image of God. And it is also showing forth how that image gets covered up, how that image gets dressed up in the aspirations, as I said earlier, a couple of weeks ago, in the aspirations of family, the aspirations of tribe, the aspirations of social class, the aspirations of whatever history deals you, and how you may try to struggle with it and deal with it, and how you do that may prejudice everybody's view of you going forward. So it would be nice to do a close reading of this whole thing, but let me just mention one other thing that struck me earlier today when I was reading these texts again. And it really, it's in a sense, in my mind, a little bit of a conversation between on the grace of holy baptism and then on this strange account of Moses and circumcision. I think I realized when I was fairly young that infant baptism was a form of circumcision. That's where it differs from believers' baptism, because it's about being, not about doing. So this is a little anecdote which may make the link. When a Jewish family brings their boy child on the 8th day to the synagogue, which is where I've witnessed it. Well, I've witnessed it in a home as well, but they will wrap the child in a linen swaddling garment. And the child will be taken, often the mother and some of the other women close to the child will hang around at the back door on another room and say, why the hell do they do this? And the child is circumcised. The mother or the grandmother will then take the swaddling garment and they will sew it into a band, and they will embroider it with a text from the Torah. And this band, they're usually pretty long, like 4 feet, 5 feet long, and decorative. There's a long history of this in Jewish material culture. They will give this band to the synagogue. So if you have a chance in a synagogue to go up, and if they'll open the ark for you, you'll see a stack of these bands, all made from the swaddling clothes at the circumcision of a child. And then these bands are taken, and the Torah scroll is wrapped. That's the first thing that goes on the Torah scroll. It's this band. It's the band from circumcision. And then there's a mantle put over the Torah scroll. And then there are crowns put on it and a shield hung down over it. The Apostle Paul, I think, was sitting in the synagogue when they brought out the Torah scroll. And that's when this text comes to him. Put on the whole armor of God. And if you read that text, you'll see the band from the circumcision. You'll see the mantle, the crowns, the shield. And Paul in that text, Paul is saying that it's his body theology, his sense that the Torah, the living Torah, is the person. The Word is incarnate. The Word is a person. And not just the person of Jesus Christ. Oh, yes, and in a very particular way. But the incarnation is the revelation about all of us. So just as in the ritual of circumcision for the Jewish people, this is the mark of the covenant, the mark of a spousal relationship. And it is of the most intimate sort. And at least for many human beings, it seems pretty vivid that it is marking the male member, which is for so many human beings, so many men anyways, is the source of such passion and struggle and misunderstanding. And it is saying that the way you are part of the world is through intimate communion, of which this is the most visceral symbol. Lovemaking is Eucharist. The Orthodox Church has understood that, even if most Orthodox people are frightened by it. So this marking of and saying that communion is the playground of God. It's what is real in life. And it is both it is on the one hand a deep, deep desire. That's the first fold in this twofold it's talking about. And that's holy. It's beautiful. It's a gift. And then the other fold in it is as it unfolds in your life, as you mature, as experience, as you encounter the world, to come to see your experience, to come to understand in all experience, to come to that kind of knowledge that Maximus talks about here, in all experience. Well, that knowledge that he's speaking about here is that great biblical knowledge, which is that you only really know ever in love. Because as both David and Michael were talking about, it is in that intimate drawing into relationship that we both know the other and realize that we are a mystery as well. And that love is embodied. It's existential. It's the heart of human experience. And maybe I shouldn't even say love there, but you know what I'm hinting at. That kind of presence and attentiveness and regard for the other, seeking the other's pleasure, the other's joy, as the greatest joy you can have, which is, of course, not a thought that comes to one. So, in any case, this so when he also talks here, and I mean, I don't understand this either, Andrew, so when he talks here about we're incapable of reverting from right discernment and truth once you achieve this in action to something else besides, which only pretends to be that same discernment. Well, when he talks about what I think he's getting at here is that when one has when one is present to another, there is no dissonance, and in that sense there is no sin.
David, I get.
And this is not a, sorry, just one second. And this is not an ideal that there is no sin, one is, and no dissonance.
No.
Let's be clear. We're not talking about what's real and then what's ideal. This is part of it too. It's somehow part of it too. Exactly what you're talking about. It's present there in all moments, experience, events of presence.
Mm-hmm.
That is true, that there is no dissonance somehow. And there is no, somehow. And David, just keeping with this passage for a moment, let me ask you one thing. And I'm sorry, David Jennings, I broke in a tiny bit. I want to leave it to you again. Whoever has participated in this theosis through experience is incapable of reverting from right discernment and truth. Now, a short while ago in one of our sessions, we were discussing the idea of the conscience as that faculty in us which will not admit lies, which is no longer capable of disguising lies. We might act against it, we might not. But if we have our conscience is not saying good, bad, right, wrong, that can be culturally acquired. But somehow it's a noetic faculty, a noetic thing within us, which renders us increasingly unable to countenance lies. Maybe that's something of what he's getting at, one, incapable of reverting from right discernment. Maybe it's on the level of conscience, not on the level of fulfillment. Maybe that's where I was getting tangled up.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. But I'm sorry, David Jennings.
And
Pardon
then
me.
once he
I had that, and I knew I'd lose it.
Oh, that's good.
No, pardon me, David. Go ahead. I didn't. You were garbled.
Ah.
Well, fair enough. Pardon me, David Jennings. Pardon me.
But the
Please.
only thing I was going to put as an input, and I know we're almost out of time, but was just, Romans 7, Paul says, I don't know. Like, I know what I don't want to do and I do it. And that I hate, I do. And so I struggle with this concept where if it isn't, that it's not just merely an ideal. I get the ideal, and I'll just put a footnote in here. I am anxious to hear a discussion about, and I recognize deification is not the right word, as you point out, right? But deification versus sanctification, if there is much of a difference, I'd like to tease that out a lot in some future discussion. But even if that's the case, if we're going beyond just simply what is a potential ideal to an actuality that exists when one is truly present, I just look at Paul, and he's admitting what, I probably, if I was a little more alert, I'd be admitting about every half an hour, I get it, but I constantly find myself in sin, doing the stuff I don't
Yes,
want to
but
do,
David,
Of course.
not doing the stuff I should do.
Of course.
but David, and pause for a moment. One of the things that we looked at on the utility of passions was the question of time, right? And speaking the language of potential, I'm sorry, now I forgot, but potential to actual, perhaps
Right.
crudely, right?
Yep.
That's almost a temporal thing, right? And I think in my understanding, what David Go was getting at, or at least what I heard him what he's getting at, was that this lack of dissonance in presence, this lack of and sin means turning away. That's all it
Yeah.
means. It means
Yep.
turning away at the wrong moment. Whoops, I'm over here. Oh, that's sin. That's all. That's all it means ever.
If you have kids of a certain
But-
age, the joke squirrel means a lot. One of those
But-
Disney movies. Squirrel.
But just like I don't think that David was really talking about time, I don't think that Maximus is here too. And I'm not sure that you are either. We're using the language time a tiny bit, but I think that what you're getting at. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more, like push a little bit past that distinction of potential and actual, because that is not necessarily temporal. It could be ontological, it could be, but it is a difference. There's some difference between those terms. And I think that in presence, like David has said earlier, there's no hierarchy in presence. There's no, sometimes the virtues destroy our capacity for presence. Presence is not where we're going to land in this whole thing. It's not the idle word, but it's an extraordinarily important word. And I think that David Goa has explicated it better than anyone else. And I've been looking because I've learned. But just can you recalibrate a little bit and maybe restate your idea, trying to move away from words which are kind of chained down with temporal implications? Is that, I don't know, but pardon me, please.
The obvious joke is we're out of time. But so I guess the question, this will just get to us discussing deification at some point, is the understanding of that. It appears in all of the writing that this is a process to which we will attune ourselves as we experience more of the good. We seek less of the bad or the irrelevant or the whatever. And just as we see the sun, we no longer see the moon, we no longer see the stars and we're not confused, not that we don't see them, but we're not confused by them. So to a deification, that we ultimately get to a point, ideally or in practice, where we have true freedom because we have true knowledge. That truth is more important than simple freedom. And so having that truth of the sun, we will never choose the moon. Likewise, the good we will never choose the not good, as we get clearer with that. While it may occur over time, it's not a temporal issue. It is a a sanctifying, it's a deifying, it's a process, but it's a clarifying process. So that's what
Okay.
I understand it to be. I would like to have a conversation around that because, as I say, Paul, writing at the very end of his life, Romans, still says, I don't know, like I'm still screwing this up regularly. And I guess at 58, I'm feeling that if this is a temporal process, I caught the wrong train because I'm not seeing, and maybe it's, the immediacy, you miss it, but I don't, I'd like to have that conversation. That's all I'm saying at that point. I'm not sure it's as good as how Maximus identifies, whether on the spiritual progress of virtue or in the baptism, where the second portion of it, beyond faith, where one can simply get to a place where your will wants it and the Spirit assists it, and you wouldn't want anything else. I don't know anyone who's like that, perhaps other than David Goa.
Right. Oh, yeah, sure. I'm the model boy, I'll tell you.
I
Yeah,
think
that's why I find reading Maximus so damn difficult, is because you realize, my God, where I haven't gotten anywhere.
I think that when I used the word temporal before, I didn't mean purely earthly finitude. I meant
Right, yeah.
thinking in terms of time. So I would buck a little about your
Fair enough.
your move there. But more importantly, what I took from what David Goa said earlier was that in the holding together of process, the activity of circumcision and so on, and that which is beyond process, the holiness of the ark,
Yeah.
the holiness of the of now again, I'm unsure whether to talk about ontology or phenomenontology, spirit, being, or spirit, but the holiness of what endures in life. I think that's where, and that's why I saw David go. At least I think I understood that you were pointing to, yes, encompassing time but not defined by time. That this idea of deificate, well, theosis as I prefer, and baptism, that it's not so simple to think of it in kind of just that way or just this other way. It's like we were talking about the other week, maybe, with the becoming, but the stance, the somehow steadiness that endures in becoming. And maybe we're approaching some kind of minor comprehension of what is meant by these people when they say things like ever moving rest, or kinetic stat, the vibrant, vital, energetic rest. I don't know.
Yeah.
David, what do you make of this? This is by way of conclusion, even.
Well, just to place David Jennings in the very center of the tradition. I mean, there's a whole bunch of the saints of the church and the church fathers and mothers that love to say that when you experience theosis, you will no longer pray, because you are prayer.
Prayer. Yeah,
But
right.
what they say immediately after that is, I've never met anybody like that. But just because you've never met anybody like that doesn't mean it shouldn't be hanging out there.
Yeah, no, you're bang on, man. And by the way, the Reformed tradition of which I'm from, absolutely on baptism, it's all about covenant. It's everything you said. We speak of the covenant because of circumcision.
Yeah.
So that's I mean.
And baptism is often spoken about as a circumcision of the heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a very beautiful evening, guys.
Indeed. Next time, just to flag this now, next time we're going to return to these because we're looking at the next 10 pages in the Cosmic Mystery volume. but the works are on Christ's conquest of the human passions. It's beautiful. And on Jesus Christ and the end of ages. So this whole discussion of time, and it's, it involved senses of realms of teleology and eschatology. Well, really, I think that our sense of time and how, insofar as we understand the saint, what he means when he's talking about teleology and eschatology will come forth.
Just a footnote on that, which speaks to, I think,
Please.
query as well. With Maximus, and I think I can say that this is part of the tradition we are walking into here. They are really getting at a kind of eschatology of being versus time. And they're saying it is communion is not a state, it's a gift. And when it happens, you're lucky. It's called grace.
Yeah.
But try to hang on to it and you'll lose it. In any case, what you've raised, David, is a huge matter, and we'll be spending the next 2 years talking about this.
Great. I have to bail. I do want to say I won't be around the next one. I'm going to be traveling, so I won't be able to join the next conference, but I look forward to watching it, and then I'll join you the next time after that.
Shame,
Yeah.
but we'll see you shortly after.
Yep, and it looks
Ciao,
like
everyone.
likewise Lorraine had to head out. Okay, take care, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.